The Jasmine was already in the courtyard when the call to prayer came. Someone had placed it there the night before, a clay pot of white flowers set on the stone ledge beside the fountain, releasing its smell into the still air before the household had stirred. The azan from the mosque at the end of the lane drifted over the courtyard wall, and Noor heard it before she was fully awake, lying on the string bed in the inner room with the thin cotton sheet pulled to her chin against the pre-dawn cool. She did not rise immediately. She listened. The voice of the muezzin was an old man's voice, steady, carrying the prayer that had been called 5 times a day in this city for 300 years. Then she rose. Welcome back to Dull Tales. If you're in bed right now, lights low, the day receding, then you're exactly where this is made for. Tonight we're going to Agra in 1640. The Mughal Empire is at the height of its power. The Emperor Shah Jahan is on the peacock throne. And 8 miles outside the city, at the edge of the Yamuna River, a building that will become perhaps the most recognized structure in human history is being built. Not yet finished, still under construction, still covered in the scaffolding of bamboo and the dust of cut marble. The Taj Mahal. But we are not going to the Taj Mahal tonight, or not mainly. We are going to the city around it, the streets of Agra in its moment of imperial greatness. This is the Agra of Noor, who manages the household of a minor Mughal official, and whose organizational competence is the reason the household runs at all. This is the Agra of Hamid, a master calligrapher in the Imperial workshop, who has been working on a manuscript commission that is already 3 years in the making. This is the Agra of the Hindu merchant Rajan, whose trading house handles the cotton cloth that moves between Agra's weavers and the European trading companies that are beginning to appear at India's ports. And it is the Agra of the traveling scholar Farrukh, who has come from Samarkand to study at the library of the Mughal court, and who finds Agra simultaneously magnificent and bewildering. There is a new story here every day. Subscribe if you want to be here for each one. Tell me where you're listening from tonight. I read every comment. Now, let's go to Agra. Somewhere out there, it's always 3 in the morning. Somewhere out there, it's always 3 in the morning. The Mughal Empire in 1640 was the largest, wealthiest empire in the world. This is not a claim that requires qualification or apology. The Mughals controlled roughly a quarter of the world's GDP at this period, a proportion greater than any single political entity would control until the British Empire at its peak. Their territory stretched from Kabul in the northwest to Bengal in the east, from Kashmir in the north to the Deccan Plateau in the south. Their army was the largest standing army in the world. Their revenue, drawn from agricultural taxation, from trade, and from the tribute of subject territories, was staggering by any comparative measure. And their court, the Mughal court, with its elaborate protocol and its brilliant concentration of artists, poets, scholars, musicians, and craftspeople, was a cultural institution of extraordinary productivity. The miniature painting tradition, the carpet-making tradition, the garden design, the architectural achievements of which the Taj Mahal is only the most famous, the literary culture in Persian and in the vernacular languages of India. All of this was produced under Mughal patronage, in the workshops and gardens and libraries of the empire's capital cities. Agra was the capital in this period. Shahjahanabad, the city that would become Delhi, was being built, but was not yet finished. So the empire's weight was in Agra, the fort, the imperial workshops, the gardens, the mosques, the bazaars that served the needs of a court city of perhaps 500,000 people. 500,000 people. In 1640, London had perhaps 400,000, Paris perhaps 300,000. Agra was larger than either. And outside its walls, the Taj Mahal was going up. The city that surrounded the Mughal fort was not one city, but several cities layered on each other. There was the imperial city, the fort itself, walled, with its mosques and audience halls and private apartments, the residence of the emperor and his household and the vast administrative machinery of the empire. There were the gardens, the Mughal garden tradition, the Chahar Bagh, the 4-part garden divided by water channels, had planted ordered green spaces throughout the city and its suburbs, the garden as a theological statement, the arrangement of nature as an image of paradise. There was the Bazaar city, the commercial Agra, organized by trade and specialty in the way of all pre-modern cities, with distinct quarters for the cloth merchants, the spice traders, the metal workers, the jewelers, the bookbinders, the food sellers. And there was the residential city, the mahallas, the neighborhoods organized partly by religion, partly by craft, partly by the accident of where people had settled when they arrived in the expanding city. The religious geography of Agra was complicated. The Mughal court was Muslim, and the ruling class was predominantly Muslim, and the great mosques of the city were Muslim institutions. But the majority of Agra's population was Hindu, following the same religious traditions that had organized Indian life for millennia before the Mughals arrived. The two communities were not separate. They were everywhere interpenetrated. Muslim merchants in Hindu bazaars, Hindu craftspeople in Muslim workshops, the neighborhoods mixed in the way of cities where commerce and daily life bring people into continuous proximity. The Mughal emperors from Akbar onward had maintained a policy of religious tolerance that was not merely pragmatic, but reflected a genuine philosophical commitment to the idea that the divine could be approached through more than one path. This policy was fraying at the edges under Aurangzeb, who would succeed Shah Jahan. But in 1640, in the middle of Shah Jahan's reign, the synthesis was still holding. Noor's household was in the Mahalla between the cloth bazaar and the mosque lane, in a building that her husband's family had occupied for 3 generations. The building was organized around a central courtyard, the Haveli form, the enclosed domestic architecture of the Mughal city. The outer walls were plain brick, the windows high and small, the gates solid wood. Inside, the courtyard with its fountain and the jasmine pot and the neem tree that provided shade in the ferocious summer. Around the courtyard, the rooms of the household, the main reception room where guests were received, the kitchen, the storerooms, the inner rooms where the family slept and the women spent most of their time. The household had 6 people in it. Noor and her husband Amir, who was a clerk in the office of the local qazi, the Islamic judge, and who was reliably at his work and reliably unable to manage the practical details of running the household. Their 2 children, a daughter of 12 and a son of 8. Amir's mother, who was 63 and whose opinions about how the household should be run were delivered continuously and sometimes helpfully. And Mina, a young woman from the countryside who helped with the cleaning and the washing in exchange for a room in the back of the building and 2 meals a day. Noor managed this household the way Giulia in Florence managed her cloth business, with the attention of someone who sees clearly what needs doing and does it without requiring instruction or acknowledgement. The water needed to be drawn before the cooking could begin. The fire needed to be lit before the water could be heated. The bread needed to be made before the children could eat. These sequences were the structure of the morning. She moved through them in the pre-dawn darkness, her knowledge of the household so complete that she needed no light to navigate. ENDOFPART. The calligraphy workshop of the Imperial Kitabkhana, the Imperial Library and Manuscript Workshop, was one of the most prestigious artistic institutions in the Mughal world. The Kitabkhana was not merely a library. It was a production workshop, a training institution, and a repository of artistic knowledge. The manuscripts it produced, illustrated histories, collections of poetry, works of philosophy and theology and natural history, were among the most beautiful objects in the world. The miniature paintings that accompanied the texts were produced by a team of specialists. The master painter who designed the composition and executed the principal figures, the landscape specialists who painted backgrounds and vegetation, the portrait specialists who were required to capture likenesses with a fidelity that the Mughal emperors demanded of their court artists, the calligraphers who produced the text pages that the images illustrated or accompanied. Hamid was one of the senior calligraphers. He had been in the Kitab Khana since the age of 15, apprenticed to a master who had trained in the tradition of the great Persian calligraphers of the previous century. He was now 41, and his hand was what it was: precise, controlled, capable of the specific qualities that different scripts and different occasions required. The Naskh script for prose text, clear, regular, the working hand of Islamic literary culture. The Nastaliq script for poetry, a more cursive, elegant form that tilted slightly from right to left, that had the quality of movement and breath that poetry required. The Thulath script for monumental inscriptions, the large, formal letters that were carved in stone and painted on tile across the mosques and tombs of the Mughal world. He worked, in 1640, on a manuscript of the Baburnama, the memoirs of Babur, the founder of the Mughal dynasty. The commission had come from Shah Jahan himself, who wanted a definitive illustrated copy to add to the Imperial library. The manuscript was large, the text long, the illustration program extensive. 62 miniatures were planned, each requiring the coordination of Hamid's calligraphy pages with the painter's images. He had been at it for 3 years. He estimated, with the equanimity of a craftsman who had long since made peace with the pace of excellence, that he had at least another 2 years to go. The pen that Hamid used was made from a reed. The kalam, the calligrapher's pen, was cut from a specific variety of reed, dried for a specific period, trimmed to a specific angle, the nib split to a precise width that determined the variation of thick and thin strokes that was the fundamental quality of Islamic calligraphy. The preparation of the kalam was itself a skill. A poorly cut pen would not produce the strokes that a well-cut pen produced, regardless of the calligrapher's ability. The pen was the interface between the calligrapher's knowledge and the surface of the paper. If the interface was wrong, the knowledge could not be transmitted. Hamid cut his own pens. He had a leather pen case with 20 pens at various stages of preparation, some fresh cut and drying, some in use, some worn to the point where they needed to be recut or discarded. The pens were his first tool of the day. Before he sat down to write, he checked each pen in his current use set, trimmed where necessary, replaced where necessary. This was not a delay. This was preparation. You could not write well with a bad pen. The preparation of the tool was the beginning of the work. The ink was also prepared fresh. Lamp black, the soot from burning oil lamps, collected and processed into a fine powder, dissolved in water to the specific consistency that the script required. Too thin and the ink spread in the paper's fibers, the edges of the strokes fuzzy. Too thick and the pen dragged, the movement impeded. The consistency, like the fermentation in Hana's indigo vat, was known by the hand and the eye and the pen's behavior, not by measurement. He dipped. He wrote. The Mughal system of artistic training was, like the European workshop system of the same period, organized around apprenticeship. A young man with demonstrated ability was brought into the workshop. In the case of the Imperial Kitab Khana, this sometimes happened at the recommendation of a senior artist who had noticed talent in a boy from a craftsman family. The apprenticeship began with the fundamentals: cleaning the workspace, preparing materials, observing the masters at work. Then copying, the apprentice copied the master's work, the master's hand, the established examples of the tradition. The copies were not imitations in the derogatory sense. They were learning, the hand absorbing the principles of the craft through the direct experience of reproducing them. A calligrapher who had copied 1,000 pages of master calligraphy had absorbed, in his hand and arm and eye, the knowledge of proportion and spacing, and the management of the brush that no amount of theoretical description could have provided. This was true of calligraphy. It was true of miniature painting. It was true of inlay work and jewelry, and the carving of stone. The Mughal crafts were organized around the transmission of skill through proximity and repetition, the master demonstrating, the apprentice observing and reproducing, the knowledge moving from one generation to the next through the accumulated experience of the workshop. Hamid had an apprentice now, a young man of 17 named Javed, from a family of booksellers in the city, who had shown an unusual sensitivity to the rhythms of Nastaliq in the tests that the Kitab Khana's supervisor had set him. Hamid was not yet sure about Javed. The sensitivity was there. The patience was not yet fully developed. Whether the patience would come, whether the boy had the temperament for a craft that required the capacity to sit with imperfection for the years it took to move through imperfection to competence, this was the question. He would know more in 2 years. In the meantime, Javed prepared the pens. The merchant Rajan kept his trading house near the cloth bazaar, in a building that was simultaneously his office, his warehouse, and his family's home. This combination of commercial and domestic space was common in the bazaar quarter of Agra, the shop or counting house on the ground floor, the family's living quarters above. The two functions interpenetrated in the way of a world where business and household were not yet separated into different categories of life. Rajan was a Hindu merchant of the Bania caste. The merchant caste, the community that had specialized in commerce for centuries, and that maintained across the subcontinent a network of trust relationships that allowed trade to be conducted without the formal legal infrastructure that European commerce was developing. The Hundi system, the Indian equivalent of the letter of credit, was organized not around legal contracts enforceable by state courts, but around the reputation and creditworthiness of individual merchants within the community. If Rajan issued a hundi, a written order for the payment of money at another location, the recipient could present it for payment to a corresponding merchant in that city, and the payment would be made because the merchant community's system of mutual accountability made it more costly to default than to pay. The reputational infrastructure was real. Rajan's trading house had been operating in Agra for 60 years. His father had established it. His grandfather had been in the trade before that. The family name meant something in the cloth trade. It meant reliable payment, honest dealing, accurate assessment of cloth quality. This reputation was the family's primary business asset, more valuable than the stock in the warehouse and the cash in the strongbox. In 1640, Rajan was navigating a new commercial reality. The European trading companies, the English East India Company, the Dutch VOC, were present at the coastal ports and beginning to push their commercial relationships inland. They bought Indian cotton cloth. They bought a great deal of it, and their buying power, backed by the capital reserves of their joint stock structures, was of a scale that individual Indian merchants had not previously encountered in their commercial relationships. Rajan was trying to figure out what this meant for his business. He had not yet fully figured it out. He was not sure anyone had. The cotton cloth of the Agra region was the product of weavers who worked in the city and in the surrounding villages. The cotton was grown in the Doab, the plain between the Yamuna and Ganges rivers, one of the most agriculturally productive regions in the world. It was harvested, ginned to remove the seeds, and spun into thread by workers, mostly women, who used the hand spindle, and in some regions, the spinning wheel that had been improved over the previous centuries. The thread was then woven on horizontal looms by the weaver castes whose hereditary occupation this was. The weaving was organized by the merchant community that connected the weavers to the market. The merchant advanced the raw cotton or thread. The weaver produced the cloth on the merchant's account. The merchant sold the cloth and settled with the weaver at the end of the production cycle. This was the putting-out system, the same system that organized the cloth trade in European cities, the merchant intermediary connecting the dispersed production of rural weavers with the concentrated demand of urban markets and long-distance trade. The cloth that Indian weavers produced in this period was extraordinary by the standards of world textiles. The fine cotton muslins of Bengal, woven to a transparency that European buyers found almost impossible to believe, were the luxury textiles of the Indian Ocean trade. The printed and dyed cottons of Gujarat and Rajasthan, the chintz and the block-printed calicos that would flood European markets in the later 17th century, were technically sophisticated goods that European textile industries could not yet replicate. The cotton trade was the largest sector of India's export economy. It was what made India rich in the way that the silk trade made Suzhou rich or the wool trade made Florence rich. Rajan was in this trade. He was, in the specific way of middlemen in any era, essential to its functioning and largely invisible in its accounts. The Yamuna River that ran beside Agra was, in 1640, a clean river. This is worth noting because the Yamuna today is among the most polluted rivers in the world. Its waters near Delhi and Agra are ecologically dead, the result of the industrial and population pressures of the 20th and 21st centuries. In 1640, before industrialization, before the population densities that modern agriculture makes possible, the Yamuna was clear enough to bathe in, to drink from in the upper stretches, to fish. The river Ghats, the stepped stone platforms descending to the water, were busy in the morning with the bathing and washing rituals that were part of daily Hindu practice, and with the ordinary laundry and water collection that all the city's residents needed. The river was also, of course, the construction site's water supply. The Taj Mahal was being built on the Yamuna's bank. The white marble from Makrana in Rajasthan was arriving by boat on the river, the stones cut to rough shape in the quarry and finished by the stonecutters working on site. The decorative inlay, the Payatra Dura work that covered the interior surfaces with intricate patterns of colored stone, required stones from across the empire and beyond. Cornelian from Gujarat, jasper from Punjab, jade and crystal from Central Asia, turquoise from Iran, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. These were being assembled by specialists who had been recruited from across the Islamic world and from India's own stone-cutting traditions. The workforce on the Taj Mahal construction at its peak numbered approximately 20,000 workers. They worked in shifts. The site never fully stopped. Hamid, walking past the distant construction scaffolding on his way to the Kitab Khana, had been watching it rise for 8 years. He had been watching it at the same pace he was writing the Baburnama, slowly, correctly, the way things that last are made. Farrukh had arrived in Agra 3 months ago from Samarkand, the great Central Asian city that had been the capital of Timur's empire 2 centuries before, and that was still, in 1640, a center of Islamic scholarship and culture. He had traveled the overland route through the passes of the Hindu Kush, down through Kabul, across the Khyber Pass into the Punjab, east along the road that connected the empire's northern territories to the capital. The journey had taken 4 months. He had traveled with a caravan of merchants, a common arrangement for scholarly travelers without the resources to maintain their own transport. The caravan offered safety in numbers, though the road from Kabul to Lahore had been peaceful. The Mughal peace, the stability that the empire had imposed on the subcontinent, meant that travel in the interior of the empire was considerably safer than travel in most other parts of the world. This was a significant achievement that contemporaries recognized. European travelers who visited India in the Mughal period consistently noted the safety of the roads within the empire's core territory, the accessibility of inns and market towns along the major routes, the functioning of the postal relay system, the dock, that moved official communications across the empire at speeds that medieval Europe had not achieved. Farrukh had noted this as he traveled. The road was good. The markets were open. The inns were reliable. The empire functioned in the way that a well-organized state functions. The basic infrastructure of movement and supply worked without requiring extraordinary effort or unusual luck. He had arrived in Agra tired, dusty, and equipped with a letter of introduction to the custodian of the Imperial Library that he hoped would give him access to the manuscripts he had come to study. The letter had worked. He was in the library. He was reading. This was sufficient. The food of Agra in 1640 was organized by the intersection of Mughal culinary tradition and the older Hindu and regional Indian cooking that the Mughals had absorbed and transformed. The Mughal kitchen, at the imperial level, the imperial kitchen, was one of the great culinary institutions of the pre-modern world. The term Mughal food is itself a simplification of a cooking tradition that had developed over a century and a half through the synthesis of Central Asian and Persian and Afghan and Indian influences. Each dynasty's cooks bringing new techniques and ingredients and flavor profiles into the imperial kitchen where they were combined, tested, refined. The spice infrastructure of the Mughal kitchen was different from the spice use of medieval European cooking, where spices were expensive imports from a distant south. India was the source of the spices. The cardamom and the black pepper and the cinnamon and the cloves and the turmeric were grown in India, arriving in Agra with the same frequency, and at a fraction of the cost that they commanded in London or Antwerp. The result was a cuisine of extraordinary spice depth, not the hot spice cuisine that a later British colonial writing would describe with a mixture of admiration and apprehension, but a cuisine of layered flavor, the spices used not to mask, but to build, each addition contributing a specific note to a composite that was more than the sum of its parts. The slow-cooked meat dishes, the korma, the nihari, the slow-braised preparations that required hours at low heat, were the glory of the Mughal table at its highest level. At Noor's household level, the food was simpler but still organized by these principles. The dal, the cooked lentils that were the protein staple of most Indian households, was seasoned with the tarka, the fried spice tempering that transformed lentils from mere sustenance into something worth eating. The roti cooked on the tawa, the flat iron griddle, the bread that accompanied every meal. The vegetables of the season, cooked with mustard seeds and ginger, and the fresh green chili that the Portuguese had brought from the Americas, and that had been adopted into Indian cooking with a speed and thoroughness that suggested it had always been there. Noor cooked breakfast in the early morning, the kitchen fire lit, the clay stove heated with the dried dung cakes that were the fuel of most Indian households that did not have access to wood. The smell of the tarka, the mustard seeds splitting in the hot oil, the cumin, the dried red chili, was the smell of the household waking up. The Mughal administrative system was called the Mansabdari system, and it organized the empire's relationship with its military and civil servants in a way that was simultaneously logical and inherently unstable. Every officer of the empire, military commander, civil administrator, local governor, was assigned a Mansab, a rank, expressed as a number, that determined the size of the cavalry force he was theoretically required to maintain, the salary he received, and his position in the imperial hierarchy. The Mansabs went from 10 at the bottom to 7,000 at the top, with only the princes of the imperial family and a handful of the empire's greatest nobles holding the highest ranks. Amir, Noor's husband, held a very modest position in the office of the local Qazi, not a Mansab exactly, since he was a clerk rather than a military officer, but a salaried position in the empire's administrative machinery at its most local level. He recorded the Qazi's decisions. He maintained the court's registers. He drafted the formal documents, the legal instruments, the judgments, the certificates that the Qazi's court produced. This was not a prestigious position. It was a secure one. The empire needed clerks. The empire needed people who could read and write in the Persian that was the empire's administrative language and in the local languages of business and commerce. Amir was one of these people, and his position was reliable in the way that positions within the imperial administrative machinery were reliable. The salary was modest but regular, the work was defined, the expectations were clear. He was good at the work. He was not, and knew he was not, going to advance significantly beyond his current position. He had made his peace with this. His wife had made rather more than peace with it. She had organized the household around his salary's limitations with an efficiency that generated a life considerably more comfortable than the salary alone would have suggested. This was, he sometimes thought, the greatest achievement of their marriage. He did not always say this. Sometimes he said it. When he did, she looked at him with an expression that was not quite a smile. The Mughal garden was a theological statement as much as a horticultural achievement. The Chahar Bagh, the four-part garden, divided by four water channels meeting at a central fountain, was based on the Quranic description of paradise. The four rivers of water, milk, wine, and honey flowing through the garden of the afterlife. The earthly garden was the image of the heavenly garden, the architectural argument that the Mughal rulers had made paradise visible on earth. This was not mere symbolism. The gardens of the Mughal city were real places of real beauty, with real flowering plants and real shade and real water sounds. In the ferocious heat of an Agra summer, the June temperatures that could reach 115 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of heat that makes the air itself feel hostile, a walled garden with mature trees and running water channels was a place of genuine physical relief as well as aesthetic pleasure. The garden was where the wealthy went to escape the heat. It was where poetry was composed and music was played, and the evening air, slightly cooled by the water in the channels, made thought possible. The great Mughal gardens, the Ram Bagh, the Madhab Bagh, the gardens that would surround the Taj Mahal itself, were open to some extent to a public that was not restricted to the court. The gardens were also, significantly, cemeteries. The Mughal tradition placed the tomb at the center of the garden, the deceased resting in the terrestrial paradise that was the image of the heavenly paradise they hoped to inhabit. The Taj Mahal was a tomb. A tomb for Mumtaz Mahal, the empress who had died in 1631, giving birth to her 14th child. Shah Jahan had spent 15 years building her this garden and this tomb. The building of the Taj Mahal was grief made permanent in marble. It was also the most accomplished architectural achievement of the Mughal period, a synthesis of Persian and Indian and Central Asian architectural traditions, the dome and the minarets and the reflecting pool all arranged with a precision that made it, when complete, the most nearly perfect large structure ever built. Hamid thought about this sometimes. He was building his own perfect thing, one character at a time. The emperor was building his. Both of them were taking longer than expected. Both of them would be worth the time. The Persian language that Hamid wrote in was not his mother tongue. His mother tongue was Punjabi, the language of his family's origin in the Punjab before his father had come to Agra seeking work in the Imperial workshops. He had learned Persian as the language of education and culture and administrative life, the way a medieval European scholar learned Latin, as the language of the world beyond the mother tongue, the language in which the texts that mattered were written, and the correspondence of importance was conducted. Persian was, in 1640, the prestige language of the entire Islamic world from the Ottoman Empire to the Mughal court. It was the language of poetry, of Hafez and Rumi and Sadi, whose verses Hamid knew by heart, as every educated person in the Islamic world knew them by heart. It was the language of administration. The Mughal state conducted its business in Persian, maintained its records in Persian, issued its farmans, imperial decrees in Persian. And it was the language of aesthetic judgment, of the critical vocabulary in which the quality of a manuscript or a garden or a building was assessed. When Shah Jahan's architects presented their designs, the criticism and approval were in Persian. When Hamid's calligraphy was assessed by the Kitab Khana's supervisor, the assessment was in Persian. When Rajan wrote to a Mughal nobleman's office about a cloth transaction, the formal letter was in Persian, even though both parties probably spoke to each other in the local Hindi that was the Bazaar language of Agra. Persian was the code that signified education, refinement, and belonging to the civilized world in the Mughal definition of civilized. Hamid wore this code the way Izumi in Kyoto wore her court robes, as both a practical tool and a statement of position. He was comfortable in it. He thought in it when he was thinking about the work. At home, with his mother and his wife, he spoke Punjabi. The world had two languages. He lived in both. The relationship between the Mughal court and the Hindu population of the empire was one of the central political and cultural questions of the period. The Mughal dynasty was Muslim, Central Asian in origin, speaking Turkey as its ancestral language and Persian as its cultural language. The population it ruled was predominantly Hindu, with significant Muslim minorities, smaller Buddhist and Jain communities, and the Sikh community that was developing its distinctive religious identity in the Punjab. The question of how to rule a religiously diverse empire without either alienating the Muslim establishment or provoking the Hindu majority into revolt was one that each Mughal emperor answered differently. Akbar, the greatest of them, had answered it with a policy of genuine pluralism, marrying Hindu Rajput wives, employing Hindu nobles in the highest positions, abolishing the jizya tax on non-Muslims, and developing the Din-i-Ilahi, an eclectic personal religious synthesis that drew on multiple traditions. His grandson Shah Jahan was more conventionally Muslim. The Din-i-Ilahi had not survived Akbar, and Shah Jahan's court culture was more firmly rooted in Islamic and Persian traditions. But the basic structure of Mughal rule, which required the cooperation of Hindu nobles and merchants and administrators, which was impossible without the participation of the Hindu majority population, meant that the pluralistic arrangements Akbar had established continued, at least in practice, through Shah Jahan's reign. Rajan's trading house operated within this arrangement. He paid the taxes. He maintained his good relationships with the Mughal officials who needed what he had and who had what he sometimes needed. He observed his Hindu religious practice without particular interference. He was, within the limits of a subordinated position in an empire ruled by a different religious community, a successful man. He was not unaware of those limits. He managed them with the pragmatism of a businessman who knows that the political environment is a given, not a choice, and who focuses his energy on what he can actually control. He could control the quality of his cloth. He could control the honesty of his dealing. He could control the relationships he maintained. He controlled these things. The Bazaar of Agra was the commercial heart of the city in a way that had no European equivalent. The bazaar was not a market in the European sense, not a periodic gathering in a designated space. It was a permanent urban infrastructure. The covered streets organized by trade, each section dedicated to a specific commodity or craft, the whole system operating continuously 6 days a week from the morning prayer to the evening prayer. The Katra, the enclosed market courtyard, had warehouses on its upper floors and shops on its ground level, and these KATRAS were the wholesale nodes of the commercial network, where merchants bought in quantity for resale. The retail bazaar was the street-level activity. The small shops, the stalls, the itinerant vendors who moved through the bazaar selling food and small goods to the shopkeepers and their customers. The food of the bazaar was its own economy. The halwai shops, the confectionery makers, produced the sweets that were both snack food and ceremonial food. The laddu and the barfi and the halwa itself, the sugar-based confections that were gifted at weddings and religious celebrations and consumed casually in the bazaar. The panwala who sold the betel leaf preparation, pan, that was the universal mild stimulant of the subcontinent. The leaf folded around lime paste and areca nut and various aromatics, chewed after meals and during the day. The chaikhana that served the sweet milky tea that was becoming the default social drink of the region. The kebab stalls where the marinated meat cooked over charcoal produced a smell that reached several streets in every direction and organized the midday traffic of the bazaar around the location of good food. Farrukh ate in the bazaar most days. The inn where he was staying, a sarai, the roadside inn that served travelers across the empire, provided a simple meal in the evening, but his midday meal he bought in the bazaar. He ate slowly, watching the bazaar's activity around him. He was taking notes. Not about the food, about the organization of the commercial life. He had come to study manuscripts, but he was also, as scholars do, noticing everything. The miniature paintings of the Mughal Kitabkhana were among the most technically demanding artworks produced in the 17th century. The format was small, typically a page that could be held in the hands. the image perhaps 6 inches by 8 inches. But within that small format, the painters achieved a density of detail and a precision of observation that required magnification to fully appreciate. The individual faces in a crowd scene had specific expressions. The flowers in a garden background were botanically identifiable species. The textures of different fabrics, the sheen of silk, the nap of velvet, the weave of cotton, were rendered differently, each with its own specific technique. The painters worked with brushes made from single hairs from squirrel tails, the finest brushwork tool available, capable of producing lines almost invisibly thin. The pigments were mineral-based, the same lapis lazuli that went into Florentine ultramarine, along with vermilion, malachite green, orpiment yellow, and the precious gold and silver that gave the best Mughal manuscripts their metallic brilliance. The painting process for a major illustration could take weeks for the most complex compositions. The face of the emperor, if the emperor appeared in the image, was painted by the most senior painter in the workshop, because the resemblance had to be exact, and the political consequence of a poorly observed imperial portrait was not pleasant to contemplate. Hamid's calligraphy pages were adjacent to these images but distinct, the calligrapher and the painter working in their separate specialized domains, both contributing to the manuscript that would be the whole. The whole, when complete, would be bound in a cover of tooled and gilded leather. The leather might have a painting on its interior face, the book folded open to reveal a garden scene. The manuscript was itself an object of art, not just a container for the text, an object. Noor's daughter was 12 years old and was being taught to read by her mother. This was not universal. Female literacy in 17th century Agra was not a given, and the education of girls in the merchant and craftsman classes varied enormously by family and by circumstance. In the Mughal court itself, the women of the imperial household were often highly educated, the daughters and wives and mothers of emperors who had access to the best tutors and the imperial library and a culture that valued learning. In the ordinary households of the city, the situation was more varied. Noor herself had learned to read from her own mother, who had insisted on it with the conviction of a woman who had understood early that the ability to read one's own accounts and letters was not an optional grace. She was passing this on. Her daughter Yamuna was sitting beside her mother in the inner room in the early afternoon, when the day was too hot for outdoor activity, reading aloud from a collection of folk stories that Noor had borrowed from a neighbor. Yamuna was a quick reader but an impatient one. She wanted to know what happened before she had fully understood what was currently happening, which was both a problem and a sign of the kind of mind that would eventually manage the impatience well. Noor corrected her when she skipped words. Yamuna groaned. Noor waited. Yamuna went back. This was education, not formally different from what Marco was receiving from Benedetto in Florence or what Sacha was receiving from Hanna in Kyoto. The knowledge passing in the relationship between an older competence and a younger one, correction shaping the transmission. The European trading companies that were beginning to affect the Indian Ocean trade in 1640 were not yet the dominant force they would become. The English East India Company had been founded in 1600. The Dutch VOC had been founded in 1602. Both companies had established trading posts, factories. They were called at the major Indian coastal ports, Surat on the Gujarat coast, Masuliputam on the Coromandel coast, and the beginning of the Calcutta operation in Bengal. They bought Indian cotton cloth, the chintz and the calicos that would eventually flood European markets with color and pattern and relatively cheap price, and they sold European silver and some European manufactured goods. The trade was profitable for everyone involved in the early period. The Indian merchants who supplied the cloth benefited from a new, large buyer with reliable payment capacity. The weavers who produced the cloth benefited from the increased demand. The European companies benefited from the extraordinary quality and price advantage of Indian textiles compared to what European looms could produce. The balance of this trade was, at this point, still heavily in India's favor. Europe was buying much more from India than India was buying from Europe. The silver that flowed into India in payment for textiles was a significant source of the liquidity that made the Mughal economy function. Rajan had begun doing business with the agents of the English company. The company agents were strange in his experience. Their business practices were different. Their concept of the contract was different. Their expectation of the timeline for the resolution of a commercial dispute was very different from the community-based system he was used to. But they paid. They paid reliably, which was the thing that mattered most in the commercial relationship. He was adjusting his practices to work with them. They were adjusting their practices to work with the realities of the Indian market, however reluctantly. The adjustment was mutual. Neither party understood the other fully. Commerce happened anyway. Commerce generally happened when there was money to be made on both sides. This was one of the truths of the world that had not changed since the beginning of commerce, and did not look likely to change soon. The music of the Mughal court was another of the great synthesized cultural products of the empire. The classical music tradition of North India, Hindustani classical music, as it is now called, had developed over the previous centuries through the interaction of the existing Hindu musical traditions with the musical culture that the Mughal rulers brought from Central Asia and Persia. The Raga system, the specific melodic frameworks, each associated with a time of day and a season and a mood, within which the improvising musician operated, was a Hindu musical inheritance of great antiquity. The instruments that the Mughal court musicians played, the sitar, the sarod, the tabla, were themselves synthetic products, the result of the same cultural synthesis that had produced the Mughal cuisine and the Mughal architectural tradition. The Drupad form, the formal, stately style of classical Hindustani singing, was the prestige form at the imperial court. Its masters were among the most honored artists in the empire, their knowledge of the ragas and their ability to improvise within them valued at the highest level of artistic achievement. Hamid heard court music occasionally, when he was working late at the Kitab Khana on days when a musical gathering was happening in the adjacent gardens. He was not a musician. He did not understand the technical dimensions of the improvisation, but he understood something about it from the perspective of his own craft. The calligrapher also operated within a system of inherited forms, the scripts, the conventions of spacing and proportion, the established models of the tradition. Within those forms there was room for the individual hand, the individual sense of rhythm, the specific quality of attention that made one calligrapher's nastaliq different from another's even when both were technically correct. Music within the raga, calligraphy within the script, the tradition as the frame, the individual as the voice within the frame. Different arts, same structure. The afternoon heat of Agra in the summer months, May and June before the monsoon broke, was of a severity that reorganized daily life around it. The heat was not merely uncomfortable. It was dangerous. Heat stroke, dehydration, the various illnesses that the heat exacerbated, these were real risks for the population without access to the refrigeration and air conditioning that the modern world uses to manage tropical heat. The city's architecture had evolved to address this. The thick brick walls of the Haveli absorbed the heat during the day and released it slowly at night, acting as thermal mass that moderated the interior temperature. The central courtyard with its fountain created a localized cooling through evaporation, the water evaporating from the fountain's surface, and the irrigation channels cooled the air immediately around them. The screened openings, the jollies, the pierced stone screens that allowed air movement while filtering the direct sun, were both decorative and functional, the pattern of the piercing designed to maximize airflow while minimizing solar gain. The shade tree was planted where it would shade the hottest afternoon surfaces. The house was oriented to minimize east and west exposure. These strategies could not eliminate the heat, but they managed it, reduced it to a level that was survivable and even, on good days, almost comfortable. In the afternoon heat, the city rested. The bazaar quieted, the workshops reduced activity, the household retreated to the inner rooms, children slept, adults lay on the string beds in the cross-ventilated corridors, the slight movement of air a luxury in itself. This was not laziness, it was physiology. The body required rest in conditions of extreme heat. The culture had organized itself around this physiological requirement. Activity in the early morning and the late afternoon and the evening, rest in the middle of the day. The pattern of a climate that demanded it. Farrukh's study of the manuscripts in the Imperial Library had a specific purpose. He was looking for variant readings of a text, a philosophical work from the 10th century that existed in multiple manuscript copies with divergent passages, and whose correct text was a matter of scholarly dispute. The Mughal Imperial Library had 3 copies of this text, collected by Akbar's librarians from different parts of the Islamic world. Whether any of these copies was the authoritative one, or whether the correct text had to be reconstructed by comparing them, was what Farrukh was here to determine. This was the philological scholarship of the age, the recovery and establishment of correct texts, the comparison of manuscript witnesses, the identification of scribal errors and later additions. It was a scholarly practice that the Florentine humanists of the previous century had also pioneered, working on Latin and Greek classical texts with the same comparative method. The methods were not identical. The Islamic manuscript tradition had its own conventions for the preservation and transmission of texts, its own scholarly apparatus for evaluating manuscript authority. But the underlying project was recognizable, to establish what the author actually wrote, as distinct from what successive generations of copyists had transmitted. Farrukh worked carefully. He had a notebook in which he recorded the variant readings of each manuscript, noting where they agreed and where they diverged. He asked the library's custodians about the provenance of each copy, where it had come from, who had owned it before the Imperial Library. The custodians were helpful. The library was a working institution, used by scholars, its organization maintained by specialists who understood its contents. He found a reading in the 3rd manuscript that resolved a passage that had been puzzling in the other 2. He sat back. He reread it. He reread it again. He was not certain, but he was closer. He would be here for another month at least. This was acceptable. He had nowhere particular to be. The Taj Mahal was finished in 1653. It had been under construction for 22 years. It had cost, in the currency of the time, an amount that the historical accounts estimate but cannot precisely determine. Some contemporary sources suggest 40 million rupees, a figure that may be accurate or may be an expression of the impossibility of measuring what the thing had actually cost in human labor and time and material. 20,000 workers, 22 years, the white marble from Makrana, the inlay stones from across the world. The calligraphers who inscribed the Quranic texts around the archways, the calligraphy, incidentally, done in a technique that made the letters appear the same size from ground level despite being higher and therefore larger as they rose, the size calibrated for perspective. Hamid knew the calligrapher who had done this work. His name was Amanat Khan, and he was Hamid's superior in the Kitabkhana's hierarchy. The inscription on the main gate of the Taj Mahal reads in part from the 89th surah of the Quran, "O soul at peace, return to your Lord, well-pleased, well-pleasing. Enter among my servants, enter my paradise." These words on marble in the hand of Amanat Khan, for the soul of Mumtaz Mahal, for the grief of Shah Jahan, for everyone who has stood beneath the arch and read them since. Hamid thought about calligraphy this way sometimes. You put words on a surface. You put them there carefully, correctly, with the full attention of your trained hand, and then you leave. And the words remain, not for you, for whoever comes after. This was the nature of the craft. The calligrapher was always writing for someone who was not yet there. The monsoon arrived in Agra in late June. It arrived not as a gradual increase in rainfall, but as a break, a specific moment when the weather changed, when the oppressive pre-monsoon heat that had been building for weeks suddenly released into rain. The first rain of the monsoon was an event that the whole city experienced simultaneously. The smell of the earth accepting water petrichor, the word that was coined centuries later to describe it, but the smell itself as old as the first rain on the first dry ground, was one of the most powerful sensory experiences of the Agra year. Noor's children ran into the courtyard when it started. This was not permitted. This was also inevitable. Every generation of Agra children had run into the first rain of the monsoon. The courtyard fountain was suddenly redundant. The sky was the fountain. The neem tree was being washed. The jasmine pot was being watered by an agency considerably more powerful than Noor. She stood in the doorway of the inner room and watched her children get thoroughly wet and felt the specific complicated feeling of a parent who knows this is inadvisable and also knows that this is one of those moments that will be remembered. She let them stay out for 10 minutes, then she called them in. The monsoon would rain for 3 months. There would be other opportunities to stand in it. Dry clothes were more immediately useful. The children came in wet and satisfied. The rain continued. The city breathed. The medical practice of Mughal India drew on 3 distinct traditions that coexisted without necessarily fully integrating. The Unani system. The Islamic medical tradition derived from Greek medicine via Arab scholars, whose name came from Unani, the Persian word for Greek, was the prestige medical system of the Mughal court and the educated Muslim population. Unani medicine operated on the humoral theory, the 4 humors of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, whose balance or imbalance determined health and illness. The treatment involved dietary management, herbal medicines, and in specific cases the physical interventions, bloodletting, cupping, that the humoral theory suggested. The Hakims who practiced Unani medicine were educated men who had studied the classic texts, Ibn Sina's canon of medicine, the works of Razi, the accumulated literature of Islamic medical scholarship. The Ayurvedic system, the ancient Indian medical tradition, operated on a different theoretical framework. The 3 doshas, or constitutional types, whose balance or imbalance produced health or illness. Ayurveda had its own extensive pharmacopoeia, its own system of pulse diagnosis, its own understanding of the body's relationship to food and season and lifestyle. And alongside both of these literate theorized traditions, there was the folk medicine of the household, the accumulated practical knowledge of what helped, passed from mother to daughter, from healer to patient, encoded in the specific preparation of herbs and the specific treatment of common ailments. Noor knew which herb helped with a child's fever. She knew this because her mother had known it. She did not know why it helped. She knew that it helped. This knowledge was as real as anything in the Hakim's canon. It was just stored differently. The Agra fort, the great red sandstone fort that Shah Jahan's grandfather Akbar had built and that Shah Jahan had significantly extended, was the center of the city's life in a way that few buildings anywhere in the world were the center of their city's life. The fort was the residence of the emperor. It was the administrative center of the empire. It was a military installation. It contained mosques, gardens, audience halls, pleasure pavilions, the harem quarters where the imperial women lived in their own city within the city. Its walls were 3 miles in circumference, 50 feet high, built of the deep red sandstone of the Rajasthani quarries. The walls were not merely defensive. They were theatrical, a statement of power visible from miles away, the color of dried blood catching the afternoon sun. The emperor held his public audience, the Jaroka Darshan, from a window in the fort every morning. The ordinary citizens of Agra and the pilgrims who came from distances to see the emperor could gather in the courtyard below the window and watch the emperor appear. This practice was both a gesture of accessibility and a display of magnificence. The emperor visible to the people, but visible from above, from behind a window, at a remove that maintained the theater of power. Shah Jahan would appear at the window with his characteristic gravity. He was by all accounts a physically impressive man, tall, with the hawkish features and the careful dress of a ruler who understood that his physical presentation was itself a political act. He did not speak to the crowd below. He appeared, he surveyed, he withdrew. The crowd dispersed, having seen the emperor, having confirmed in the seeing that the empire was real, the emperor was present, the order of things was intact. This was the function of the ritual, order confirmed through presence. The emperor as the still point around which the empire's motion organized itself. Rajan's most complex current transaction involved a shipment of cotton cloth that had been destined for the Surat port and the company agents there, but that had been delayed by a dispute about the quality assessment of the goods. The English company's agent in Surat, a young man of 25 who had been in India for 2 years and who spoke functional Persian and passable Hindustani, had rejected a portion of the shipment on grounds that the cloth did not meet the specifications of the order. Rajan believed the rejection was unjustified. The cloth met the specifications. The English agent was using the quality dispute as leverage to renegotiate the price. This was a negotiating technique that Rajan recognized. He had used versions of it himself from the other side of the transaction. He wrote to the company agent in the careful Persian that was his formal commercial language, acknowledging the concern, offering a third-party assessment by a master cloth merchant of established reputation, and declining to renegotiate the price on the basis of an assessment that had not yet been conducted. The letter was polite. It was firm. It was designed to make the agent understand that Rajan had been doing this longer than the agent had been alive, and that he understood exactly what was happening and was not going to pretend otherwise. The agent would either accept the third-party assessment process or he would not. If he did not, Rajan would find other buyers for the cloth. There were other buyers. There had always been other buyers. The English company was new. The market was old. Rajan sent the letter and went back to reviewing his accounts. The scholarship that Farrukh conducted in the Imperial Library had a specific consequence that he had not anticipated when he arrived. He was not only studying the text he had come to study, he was encountering other texts that he had not known existed and that raised questions he had not known he was going to have. The Imperial Library was vast. It contained manuscripts from across the Islamic world and beyond, Sanskrit texts that the Mughals had collected as part of their general intellectual acquisitiveness, Persian translations of Sanskrit philosophical and mathematical works, Chinese texts that had arrived by uncertain routes. It was a repository of the accumulated intellectual production of a substantial portion of the world, assembled in one place by the resources of the empire's wealth. Farrukh spent more time than he had planned simply moving from shelf to shelf, reading the opening pages of manuscripts he had not known existed, following the threads of reference and connection that led from the text he was studying to other texts that illuminated it. He had come for a month. He was now planning for 3. He wrote to his colleagues in Samarkand with a list of manuscripts he had found that he thought they should know about. He wrote to the scholars in Isfahan who were working on related questions. He was a node in a network of knowledge, a network that connected, through the postal routes and the caravan roads and the sea lanes of the Indian Ocean trade, scholars from Istanbul to Isfahan to Samarkand to Agra to Cairo. The Mughal library was a place where this network concentrated, where the manuscripts from different points in the network could be compared, where the questions that individual scholars were pursuing in isolation could be seen in relation to each other. This was, he thought, what a library was for, not storage, not the archive, the encounter, the place where you found the thing you had not known you were looking for. Hamid finished his day's calligraphy work in the late afternoon. He cleaned his pens. He covered the ink stone. He rolled the completed section of the manuscript carefully. The paper's tendency to curl required that it be stored rolled, but the rolling had to be the correct tightness, the paper not stressed. He examined the morning's work one more time before storing it. The passage was from Babur's account of his first years in Hindustan, the early campaigns that had established the Mughal presence in the subcontinent. Babur wrote as well as he fought. The Baburnama was not a dry chronicle of events but a document of observation and feeling, the record of a man who was simultaneously a conqueror and a naturalist, who noted the species of birds in a garden with the same precision he brought to the tactical assessment of a battlefield. The calligraphy had to do justice to this. The hand of a man writing the words of a man who had written with his own hand, two hands, centuries apart, the paper between them. Hamid found this the most compelling thing about his work, not the technical achievement, not the Persian script in its formal beauty, the transmission. The fact that Babur had thought these things and written them, and that Hamid's hand was now carrying those thoughts forward, and that someone else's hands would one day turn these pages. The manuscript was a chain of hands. He was one link. He added his link with care. He stored the day's work. He put on his outer robe. He walked home through the evening streets of Agra, the city settling into its evening register around him. The call to prayer began somewhere ahead. He adjusted his pace to arrive home in time for the evening meal. The jasmine in the neighbor's courtyard was releasing its smell into the cooling air. He passed through his own gate. His wife had the meal ready. He sat down. He was home. The Mughal miniature painting tradition had developed a specific relationship with portraiture that was unusual in the Islamic world. Islamic art had, in many of its forms, avoided the representation of the human figure, not because the Quran explicitly prohibits it, but because of a scholarly tradition that interpreted certain hadith as prohibiting the making of images of living beings. The Mughal court had a different tradition. From Akbar onward, the Mughal emperors had not only permitted but actively cultivated figurative painting, including portraiture. The emperor wanted his image recorded. He wanted the events of his reign illustrated. He wanted the natural world, the plants and animals of his domains, depicted with accuracy. The result was a tradition of observation-based painting that was genuinely empirical in its approach. The court painters studied their subjects, practiced drawing from life, developed the capacity to capture specific individual likenesses. The portrait of a Mughal emperor from this period is recognizably a specific person. The face has the individuality of a person rather than the generic features of a type. This seems obvious until you consider that it was not the norm, that most portraiture in the world in most periods represented types rather than individuals, the social role rather than the face of the specific person who held it. The Mughal insistence on specific likeness was an artistic innovation. It was also a political statement. The emperor as a specific individual, with a specific face, documented in a specific moment. The history of the empire was personalized. The painting was the evidence. The Kitabkhana was the archive. The night sky over Agra in 1640 was of the same extraordinary quality as the night sky over medieval Kyoto. No electric light. No significant industrial pollution. The atmosphere above the Indo-Gangetic Plain was, in July after the monsoon rains had washed it clean, remarkably clear. The Milky Way was a structural feature of the night, not a suggestion. The planets were identifiable without instruments. The stars were present in the way that they are simply not present in any inhabited place in the modern world. The Mughal court had an active astronomical tradition. The calendar was lunar, requiring astronomical calculation for its maintenance. The scheduling of auspicious times for important events, marriages, coronations, the beginning of military campaigns, was in the hands of the court astronomers who maintained the tables of planetary positions. The observatories at Delhi and Jaipur, the Jantar-Mantar complexes, would not be built until the 18th century, but the astronomical tradition that would build them was already present in the court's intellectual culture. Farrukh knew this tradition. He had studied astronomy in Samarkand, where Ulugh Beg's great 15th century observatory had produced star tables that were still in use. He sometimes went to the rooftop of his sarai in the late evening, when the heat had moderated and the post-monsoon sky was clear, and identified the planets by their specific quality of light, the reddish cast of Mars, the steady brightness of Jupiter, the pale gold of Saturn. He was not making observations. He was not producing new knowledge. He was simply keeping company with the sky that everyone before him had also kept company with. The planets moved in their orbits. The stars held their positions. The universe continued its business, as it always had, without particular concern for the observations of the man on the rooftop. He found this comforting. The Mughal system of taxation was, by the standards of the time, remarkably systematic. Akbar's finance minister, Raja Mahal, had conducted a comprehensive survey of the empire's agricultural land in the late 16th century, measuring the area of cultivated land, assessing its productivity by soil type and crop type, and fixing the land revenue assessment accordingly. The result was the Zabti system, a detailed schedule of tax rates based on actual agricultural conditions rather than the rough estimates that had organized taxation before. This was, in terms of administrative capacity, a remarkable achievement. The survey required literate assessors in every district of the empire, the processing of enormous quantities of local data, and the maintenance of records that connected the individual farmer's plot to the imperial revenue account. The Mughal revenue system was also, inevitably, a system of considerable extraction. The land revenue was set at approximately one-third of the crop's estimated value, a proportion that left the peasant family with enough to survive in good years, but with little buffer against bad years. In bad years, drought, flood, crop failure, the revenue demand continued even when the harvest did not. This produced periodic agrarian crises, waves of peasant indebtedness, and occasional flight from the land when the combination of tax burden and environmental stress made staying unviable. Rajan knew about this from the other side. When the harvest in the cotton-growing region was poor, the weavers received less raw material. When the weavers received less material, they produced less cloth. When they produced less cloth, Rajan had less to sell. The agrarian system and the commercial system were connected by exactly these chains of dependency, and a disruption at one end of the chain rippled through to the other. He maintained a buffer, reserve cloth, advance contracts that smoothed out the supply fluctuation. He had learned the necessity of this buffer from his father, who had learned it from his. The buffer was not insurance, it was experience. The Zenana, the women's quarters of the Mughal household, was both a constraint and a world. In the households of the upper classes, the strict separation of women from male outsiders was a mark of status and respectability, the architectural expression of the purdah practice that characterized Muslim elite life across the Islamic world. The Haveli's inner rooms were the Zenana, the space where the household's women lived, received guests of their own gender, raised children, managed the domestic economy, and conducted the social life of the household among themselves. Noor's household was not grand enough for a formal purdah separation. In the smaller merchant and clerical households of the city, the strict architectural separation was impractical, but the principle was present. She did not appear before male guests who were not family members. She conducted her interactions with the outside world, the market, the neighbor, the various transactions of household management, through a combination of Mina's physical presence and her own managed appearance, maintaining the correct degree of modesty appropriate to her class position. This was not experienced, necessarily, as oppression. The women who lived within this system were not simply passive objects of male authority. They had their own networks, their own sources of information, their own forms of influence. Noor knew things about the neighborhood that her husband did not know, about the financial situation of various households, the health of the neighboring families, the reliability of the various tradespeople who serviced the Mahal. This knowledge was gathered through the networks of women's social life, the visits between households, the information that moved through the women's networks of the city with a speed and accuracy that the male public life did not always match. The Zenana was not merely a constraint. It was also a domain, and domains have their own authority. The evening meal in Noor's household was the main meal. The morning had been the bread and dal of the early day, quick, practical, the fuel for the morning's work. The evening meal was more elaborate, a rice dish, the biryani that was the Mughal synthesis of Persian pilaf and Indian spiced rice, made with whatever meat or vegetables were available and affordable. Tonight it was chicken, bought from the poultry seller in the bazaar, marinated in yogurt and spices and slow-cooked with the rice in the sealed pot method that concentrated the flavors. The smell of the evening biryani was one of the smells that would, for the rest of her children's lives, mean home. They ate together, the family and Amir's mother, on the string beds in the courtyard as the evening cooled enough to make outdoor eating comfortable. Amir spoke about his day at the Qazi's court, a property dispute between two neighboring families that had been dragging on for months and that showed no sign of resolution. His mother had opinions about the families involved, both of which were incorrect, and shared them. Noor listened. She had opinions too. She did not share them. This was a form of restraint that she had developed over years of marriage, the recognition that not all opinions improved a conversation by being in it. She ate the biryani. It was very good. She had made it. She knew it was good. This was sufficient. The night came. The children were settled. Amir's mother retired. Mina finished the washing. The courtyard was quiet. The jasmine was releasing its smell again, as it did every evening its strongest hour. Noor sat in the courtyard alone for a few minutes. She did not think about anything in particular. She listened to the city at night, the distant call of a watchman, the sound of a dog, the ambient sound of 500,000 people in their various modes of sleep and wakefulness. She breathed the jasmine. Then she went in. The Mughal Empire that existed in 1640 would not exist in the same form for much longer. The events that would transform it were already in motion, though not yet visible from inside the ordinary life of the city. Shah Jahan would be imprisoned by his son Aurangzeb in 1658, a palace coup, the sons of powerful rulers competing for the succession in the way of dynasties without fixed primogeniture. Shah Jahan would spend the last 8 years of his life confined to the Agra fort, with a view, from his window, of the Taj Mahal he had built for his wife. Whether he found this comforting or agonizing is something the historical record does not resolve. Aurangzeb, who would rule the empire until 1707, was a different kind of ruler than his father, more austere, more orthodox in his religious practice, reversing some of the pluralistic policies of the preceding reigns. The jizya tax on non-Muslims was reimposed. Temples were destroyed in some provinces. The synthesis that had characterized the Mughal Golden Age frayed. And the empire, despite Aurangzeb's military campaigns that extended Mughal control further south than any previous ruler had achieved, was already experiencing the fiscal and administrative pressures that would lead to its fragmentation in the 18th century. The English East India Company, which in 1640 was a trading concern with a few coastal factories, would be, by 1800, the de facto ruler of much of the subcontinent. The history of how this happened, how a trading company became an empire, how the Mughal Empire fragmented, how the British colonial system was established, and what it did to the society it controlled, is one of the longest and most consequential transformations in world history. None of this was visible in 1640. In 1640, the empire was at its height. Noor was making biryani. Hamid was copying the Baburnama. Rajan was writing to the company agent about the cloth. Farrukh was reading in the library. The jasmine was flowering in the courtyard. The weaving tradition of the Agra region produced a cloth called kinkwab, a silk brocade woven with gold and silver thread. It was among the most expensive textiles produced anywhere in the world. The kinkwab was the cloth of ceremony, the court dress for formal occasions, the fabric of important gifts between rulers, the textile that European traders bought at the highest prices and that found its way into the treasuries of European monarchs as evidence of the extraordinary skill of Indian textile production. The weavers who made it were specialists within specialists, weavers who had spent their entire apprenticeship learning the specific techniques of drawloom weaving with metal thread, who could operate the complex pattern programming of the traditional drawloom with the precision that the dense pattern repeats of kinkwab required. They worked slowly. The cloth was dense with labor. A weaver producing kinkwab might complete a few inches in a day. The cost was the cost of the materials and the cost of the time was the time of a human life organized around the production of a specific beautiful thing. Rajan did not trade in kinkwab. It was too specialized, too expensive, too limited in its market for the kind of volume trade he conducted. But he knew the kinkwab weavers by name. He knew their neighborhood, their workshops, the families whose grandfathers had established the techniques and whose grandchildren were currently maintaining them. He appreciated the cloth in the way that a person who works in the trade appreciates the best product of the trade, not as a customer exactly, but as someone who knows what it costs to make it and who has enough aesthetic intelligence to recognize when it has been made well. The kinkwab was made well. It was always made well. You did not survive as a kinkwab weaver if you made it poorly. The market knew. The monsoon season in Agra had its own aesthetic tradition. The Raga Mayan Kai Malhar, the rain Raga, the musical framework associated specifically with the monsoon, was one of the most celebrated forms in the Hindustani classical tradition. It was played and sung in the monsoon season only, its specific combination of intervals and ornaments expressing the specific emotional complex of the rain, relief, abundance, the dramatic change from the parched heat to the wet green of the monsoon months. The poetry of the monsoon was equally specific. The classical Sanskrit and Hindi poetic traditions had developed an elaborate vocabulary for monsoon imagery, the peacock dancing in the rain, the kadamba flower that bloomed only in the monsoon, the kikilla bird whose call was associated with longing and reunion. The monsoon was not just weather. It was the emotional climax of the Indian year. After the long months of summer heat, after the anticipation that built as May became June, and the sky began to show the signs of the approaching wet season, the first rain of the monsoon was an emotional as well as physical relief. The music played for this season expressed this relief, the opening of the raga like the first drops, the development of the improvisation like the building rain, the deep satisfaction of the fully established monsoon in the long, slow passages of the raga's conclusion. Hamid was not a musician, but he had heard the Malhar performed on a monsoon evening at a court gathering where he had been present, and he had understood why the music existed. He had felt it. The rain was outside. The music was inside. Both were saying the same thing. This was enough. This was actually more than enough. This was what art was for. The relationship between the Mughal court and the artists it employed was a relationship of absolute dependence and enormous reward. The artists of the Kitabkhana received salaries, regular payment that was secure as long as they remained in favor. They received housing. They received the social status of being imperial employees, which in a society organized around the prestige of court connection was significant. And they received the resources, the finest materials, the access to the imperial collection and its models and exemplars that their work required. In exchange, their work belonged to the court. They did not own what they made. They made it for the emperor. This was not experienced as deprivation. It was the structure within which they worked, and it was a structure that provided the material basis for work of extraordinary quality. The artist who had to worry about finding patrons and negotiating commissions and collecting payments was the artist who was using creative energy for commercial management. The imperial workshop artist had this managed for him. His energy went to the work. This was the Medici model, the Mughal model, the model of every great patronage system. The patron absorbs the management burden so the artist can concentrate on the making. The cost was the loss of the artist's independence. The work belonged to the patron. This was a real loss. Hamid knew that the Baburnama he was producing would go into the Imperial Library and not come out, that he would not be able to show it, loan it, give it away, use it as evidence of his quality when seeking a different commission. He had no different commission. He was in the Imperial workshop. The work was its own evidence, available to anyone whom the Emperor permitted to see it. He accepted this. He had no choice but to accept this, and within the acceptance there was genuine satisfaction. The work was good, it was going to last, it was enough. The library that Farrukh was studying in had been assembled over 4 generations of Mughal emperors, each adding to what the previous had built. Babur, the founder, had been a bibliophile. The Baburnama itself demonstrated the quality of his prose, and a man who wrote like that also read. Humayun, his son, had lost almost everything, his empire, temporarily, and much of his personal library, during the years of his exile from Hindustan, and had acquired new manuscripts in the Persian court where he took refuge. Akbar, who ruled for almost 50 years, had been the great builder of the Imperial Library, not himself able to read, by some accounts, but deeply appreciative of books and manuscripts, who had texts read to him by his courtiers, and who commissioned the illustration of hundreds of manuscripts. Jahangir, Shah Jahan's father, had been a connoisseur of painting of acute judgment, and the library under his patronage had developed the portrait tradition and the nature study that made Mughal painting distinctive. Shah Jahan had continued this, adding to the collection, commissioning new manuscripts, maintaining the Kitabkhana as a working institution. The library that resulted was, in terms of the quality and variety of its holdings, one of the greatest manuscript libraries that had ever existed. It was also a library that would have a very difficult subsequent history. The fragmentation of the Mughal Empire in the 18th century, the British conquest and the reorganization of Indian institutions, the auctions and dispersals of Mughal court property, all of this scattered the collection. Today, Mughal manuscripts are in the British Library in London, in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, in the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin, in private collections across the world. The collection that had been assembled in one place for one purpose by one empire's resources is now distributed across the institutions that benefited from that empire's decline. Farrukh, reading in the library in 1640, did not know this. He was reading. He was finding what he had come to find, and more than he had come to find. The library was whole. The empire was at its height. The manuscripts were here in this room, available to the hand that reached for them. The Taj Mahal receives, in the modern world, 7 to 8 million visitors per year. It is the most visited monument in India and one of the most visited monuments in the world. People come from every country in every season. They come at sunrise to see the marble turn pink and gold in the first light. They come at full moon to see it glow in the lunar reflection. They come in the afternoon and see it white and blinding in the full Indian sun. They come and stand in the same courtyard where the original visitors stood, looking at the same dome, the same minarets, the same reflecting pool that extends the image of the building into the water. They feel what the building was designed to make them feel, not what the theological program intended. Most visitors do not know the Quranic inscriptions around the arches or their significance, but the beauty, the proportion, the sense that something extraordinary has been achieved here, that human skill and human intention and the right conditions and the right resources have combined to make something that exceeds the sum of those components. This feeling does not require historical knowledge to experience. It requires only the willingness to stop and look. What the visitors are looking at is the grief of a man who lost his wife, crystallized in white marble, standing beside the river where the marble arrived by boat from the quarries of Rajasthan. 22 years of work. 20,000 workers, the calligraphy of Amanat Khan, the white marble from Makrana, the inlay stones from across the world, the Yamuna river beside it, the jasmine in the courtyard gardens still blooming in season, and Mumtaz Mahal in the tomb at the center, among the Quranic promise of the paradise that the garden was designed to represent. This is what love built. This is what grief could do when it had the resources of the richest empire in the world and the will to make something permanent from the impermanent. It lasts. It was meant to last. And it does. The children of Agra in 1640 grew up knowing the Taj Mahal as a construction site. They grew up knowing the sound of chisels on marble as ordinary. They grew up knowing that the white dome on the far bank of the Yamuna was not finished yet, that it would be finished someday, that their parents spoke of it as a thing that was being done rather than a thing that existed. The children who were 10 years old in 1640 would have been 23 when the Taj was complete in 1653. They would have crossed to the south bank of the Yamuna and stood in the garden and looked at the finished thing and understood, perhaps, what the construction noise of their childhood had been building toward. But in 1640, in the year of Noor and Hamid and Rajan and Farrukh, the dome was visible across the river, rising above its scaffolding, and the children of the city played in the alleys while their parents went to work, and the marble was laid, and the calligraphers wrote their letters, and the merchants calculated their margins, and the empire ran. The Mansabdari system that kept the empire's bureaucracy and military organized was, in its way, a machine for converting loyalty into function. Every Mansabdar, every ranked official, held two numbers: a Zat, which indicated their personal rank and determined their pay, and a Sawar, which indicated the number of cavalry they were required to maintain. Shah Jahan's court in 1640 had hundreds of Mansabdars at different ranks, from the great emirs at rank 5,000 or above down to the minor officials at rank 100 who were barely distinguishable from a prosperous merchant. Amir, Noor's husband, was a clerk in the revenue department, well below the Mansabdar threshold, doing the administrative work that supported the people who held ranks. He had been doing this work for 11 years. He was good at it, careful, accurate, politically aware without being politically ambitious. He knew which decisions required written justification, and which required verbal approval, and which could simply be done without documentation, and then documented afterward. This knowledge was not in any manual. It was the accumulated wisdom of 11 years of watching which documents were acted on, and which were filed and which were quietly lost. He came home from the revenue office each evening with this knowledge intact and no visible way to pass it to anyone, because it was not the kind of knowledge that could be written down. Nor saw it in him, the weight of the unwritable knowledge, the way he sat at the evening meal with a particular quality of silence that was not tiredness so much as full. She did not ask him to explain it. She understood that it could not be explained. She put the food in front of him and let him be full in peace. The imperial postal system, the Dak, connected Agra to the empire's furthest provinces in a way that would not seem remarkable to a modern reader, but was extraordinary in the 17th century. Relay stations were positioned at intervals along the major roads, each with a fresh horse and a rider waiting. A message sent from Agra could reach Lahore, 400 miles to the northwest, in 3 days. A message could reach the Deccan in a week. The emperor's commands moved through this system as a constant flow. Orders to provincial governors, responses from local officials, revenue reports, military assessments, the paperwork of an empire administered across distances that would take an individual traveler weeks to cross. Rajan used the postal system for his business correspondence. He paid a premium for the privilege. The imperial Dak carried official correspondence, and merchants who wanted their letters moved at imperial speed paid accordingly. But the premium was worth it when the information in the letter had time value. A letter to his partner in Surat could arrive in 5 days. A letter to the English factory at Surat could arrive in 5 days. The response, if the partner or the English factor wrote back immediately, could arrive in 10. 2 weeks for a complete round of negotiation across 400 miles of road. This was fast. In Rajan's grandfather's time, the same exchange would have taken a month. The empire's infrastructure, whatever its other qualities, had made commerce faster. Rajan was aware that the empire's infrastructure was the reason his business was possible at scale. He was also aware that the empire could, at any moment, change the terms on which merchants operated. The awareness of this was not fear exactly. It was the professional realism of a man who understood that the ground he was standing on was not his. Farrukh, in his room at the caravanserai, was finishing a letter of his own. Not to his family. He had written to them 2 weeks ago, and he would write again in another month. This letter was to a scholar he had met at the Imperial Library 3 weeks ago, a man named Ahmed who had come from Isfahan and was returning there in the spring. Ahmed had mentioned, in passing, that the library at Isfahan had a manuscript of Avicenna's Canon of Medicine that contained a commentary in the margins dated to the 12th century, a commentary that Farrukh had read references to but had never seen. In Isfahan. This was new information. Farrukh's letter was asking Ahmed whether it would be possible for a copy of the marginal commentary to be made and sent to Agra. He was offering to pay for the copy. He was also offering to send, in exchange, a copy of a marginal commentary on an astronomical text that the Agra library held and that Ahmed had expressed interest in. This was how scholarship worked across the distances of the 17th century. Letters, offers, the slow circulation of copied texts. A scholarly network that stretched from Istanbul to Cairo to Isfahan to Agra to Delhi, connected not by any institution but by the relationships between individual scholars who wrote to each other and sent books and passed through each other's cities. Farrukh was a node in this network. He was also, at this moment, a man sitting in a caravanserai in Agra with a letter half finished and his dinner growing cold beside him, pausing to think of the right phrase for the request. The right phrase was important. Ahmed was not obligated to help him. The tone of the letter had to convey both the importance of the request and the ease of refusing it. Farrukh found the phrase. He finished the letter. He ate the cold food. He thought about Isfahan. The question of what Agra smelled like in 1640 is not one that the historians have spent much time on. But a city of 500,000 people, in 1640, before sanitation systems, before organized waste removal, before the industrial food chain that moves the evidence of mass meat production to the edges of cities, a city of that size smelled like a city of that size. The Yamuna carried waste downstream. The alleyways carried waste toward the Yamuna. The animals, the oxen, the horses, the donkeys, the camels in the caravanserai produced what animals produce in the quantities that animals of that number produce it. The tanneries had a smell. The dye houses had a smell. The fish market by the river had a smell. And against all of this, the jasmine in the courtyards, the incense in the mosques, the cardamom in the bazaar tea stalls, the sandalwood that wealthy households burned for air, the marigolds strung at the gates. The city was both things at once. The jasmine was real. The river smell was real. They coexisted the way everything coexists in a city, not neutralizing each other, but layered, each present in its own domain, the smell of a place being the sum of all its particular smells, none of them the whole truth. Noor's courtyard smelled like jasmine at night because the jasmine grew there and she kept it. The street outside her gate smelled like the street. These were both Agra. The monsoon of 1640 had been good. The harvest in the surrounding countryside had come in at slightly above the expected yield. This meant that the grain prices in the bazaar were lower than in a lean year. This meant that Noor's household food budget went slightly further than usual. This meant that she had been able, for 3 weeks in October, to serve the evening meal with slightly more bread than was strictly necessary, and to add a small amount of jaggery to the children's afternoon snack, and to not think twice about the quantity of ghee she used for the dal. These were small things. They were the small things that the harvest's goodness translated into, household by household, across the city. The emperor's revenue assessors noted the good harvest at the provincial level. The market prices noted it at the bazaar level, nor noted it in the evening bread. The city was made of people noting it in different ways at different scales, and the sum of their noting was the city's experience of a good year. The year was good. She knew this in the bread, in the ghee, in the jaggery. She was grateful for it with the ordinary gratitude of a person for whom a good year is a relief rather than an expectation. Rajan kept a small ledger separate from his main accounts, not for the tax assessors, for himself. In it he recorded the things that did not fit in the main ledger, the observations that were not transactions, the patterns he noticed in the market that were not yet numbers. This week's entry read, "The English factor at Surat is asking about pepper volumes for next season already. This is early. Something is changing in the European demand." He did not know what it meant yet. He wrote it down so that he would remember that he had noticed it. The small ledger was full of such observations. Most of them turned out to mean nothing. A few of them had turned out to mean something significant. He could not know in advance which was which. So he wrote them all down and he waited, and the market told him eventually what to do with what he had noticed. This was the work, not just the buying and selling, the noticing, the waiting. The patience of a man who understood that the market was smarter than any individual reading it, and that the best he could do was pay attention and be ready. The Yamuna at Agra in 1640 was approximately 200 yards wide at the point where it passed the city. In the monsoon season, it was wider. The banks flooded. The low-lying areas near the river became temporarily part of the river. The boats that moved goods could reach parts of the city that were unreachable in the dry months. In the dry months, the river narrowed to its main channel, and the ghats, the stepped embankments that descended into the water, extended further before reaching the current. The morning bathers came to the ghats in all seasons. In the cold months, they waded in quickly, performed their ablutions with the speed of people for whom the water was cold but the ritual was non-negotiable, and waded out again. In the hot months, they lingered. The bathing ghat near the central market district was one of the places where Agra's population mixed across the usual divisions. The divisions of neighborhood and caste and religion that sorted the city into its various precincts were less enforced at the water's edge, where everyone was wet, and the social distinctions required dry clothes and correct address to maintain. Noor did not bathe at the ghat. She bathed at home, with the water she had drawn and warmed. But she walked past the ghat on her way to the spice market on the days when the route took her that way, and she saw the morning bathers, and she felt something that was neither envy nor its opposite but simply observation. The city doing what the city did, the Yamuna receiving it. Hamid had a system for the days when the calligraphy refused to come. Every calligrapher had such days. The hand knew what to do, the training of 20 years had written the knowledge into the muscles, but something between the knowing and the doing went wrong, and the characters that emerged on the paper were technically correct and spiritually absent, which was worse than incorrect. On those days, Hamid stopped. He put down the pen. He covered the work in progress. He sat for a while in the stillness of the Kitabkhana, the other calligraphers working around him, their pens audible as the lightest possible sound on the prepared paper, and he waited, not for inspiration. Inspiration was a word for people who worked differently. He was waiting for the absence of the thing that was blocking the work. He could not identify the thing. It was sometimes tiredness, but tiredness alone did not produce it. It was sometimes distraction, but distraction alone did not produce it. It was some quality of distance from the work, as if the calligrapher and the page had temporarily become strangers who had forgotten what they shared. He waited until they remembered. It usually took between half an hour and an hour. Then he uncovered the work. He picked up the pen. He wrote a single character to test whether the forgetting was over. Sometimes it was over. Sometimes it needed another half hour. He was patient about this. He had learned over 20 years that impatience made the absence longer. The work arrived in its own time. His job was to be ready when it did. The kite sellers of Agra worked from carts near the bazaar's edge. Paper kites in red and yellow and green, strung on lightweight bamboo frames, trailing their tails of twisted paper. In the afternoons, when the wind came off the Yamuna, the kite flying could be seen from the rooftops across the city. The sky above the terraced houses dotted with the small, bright shapes of kites in the hands of children and adults who needed, for an hour, to be doing nothing more complicated than keeping something aloft. Noor's son was 8 years old and obsessed with kites. He had been given a red one 3 months ago, and it had survived 3 months of use with repairs, 2 relacings of the bamboo crosspiece, one patch of tissue paper over a tier, and was still flying. He flew it from the rooftop in the afternoons when his lessons were done. Noor could hear him from the kitchen, the sound of his running footsteps on the flat rooftop, the occasional shout when the kite caught a particularly strong gust and pulled, the sustained silence of concentration when the kite was high and steady. She listened to this as she worked. It was the sound of a child doing what children do when the conditions are right. The Yamuna sending wind across the city catching it in paper and bamboo, the 8-year-old on the rooftop connecting himself to the sky. The ordinary miracle of an afternoon in Agra. The empire would not last, but no empire does. What they leave behind is the evidence of the work, the marble, the manuscripts, the music, the language, the food, the thread of the kinkwab weaver, the line of the calligrapher's pen. In 1640, none of this was past tense. It was present tense. It was happening. Noor was drawing the water. Hamid was trimming the pen. Rajan was reading the letter from Surat. Farrukh was finishing the note to Ahmed in Isfahan. The kite was on the rooftop. The Jasmine was in the courtyard. The Taj Mahal was rising, stone by stone, on the south bank of the Yamuna. And somewhere in the city, at the hour before dawn, a muezzin was climbing the minaret stairs to call the first prayer of the morning, and the sound he made would cross the rooftops and the river and the marble rising from the south bank and reach the sleeping city, and the city would stir, and the day would begin. As it always began, as it will always have begun, in Agra, in 1640, in the middle of the greatest century. The spice market near the Agra fort opened before the call to prayer. The merchants who ran the wholesale stalls arrived in the dark, while the streets were still quiet, to receive the night's deliveries from the caravans: cardamom from Kerala, black pepper from the Malabar coast, cloves from further east, arrived via the coastal traders, saffron from Kashmir, the red threads wrapped in cloth, each gram carefully weighed. The spice trade was ancient, older than the Mughal Empire, older than Islam in India, older than most of the systems that organized the world of 1640. The spice trade had brought the Portuguese around Africa and up the Indian coast. The spice trade was bringing the English and the Dutch to the same coast. The spice trade was one of the reasons that the world that Noor and Rajan and Hamid and Farrukh lived in looked the way it did. Because the desire for the things that grew in this part of the world had pulled the rest of the world toward it for centuries, and the Mughal Empire was one of the largest and most powerful entities that had organized itself around the fact of that desire. The cardamom in Noor's biryani had come from 1,000 miles away. The saffron that colored the rice had come from 500 miles away. The pepper had crossed the ocean. The meal she cooked was the sum of these distances, the convergence of the trade routes in a clay pot on a fire in a courtyard in Agra, made ordinary by repetition, made possible by the empire that held the roads open and the merchants who moved along them and the farmers who grew what grew in the places where it grew. This is what a civilization is when you look at it from close enough. Spices from 1,000 miles away. A child's kite on the rooftop. The pen moving across the paper. The jasmine in the courtyard. The water drawn before dawn. The city of Agra is still there. The fort is there, you can visit it, walk the red sandstone corridors that Shah Jahan walked, look from the same windows at the Yamuna and the Taj across the river. The Taj is there, 8 miles from the fort, the white marble still white after almost 4 centuries, the minarets still standing at their slight outward lean that was designed to prevent them from falling inward in case of earthquake. The gardens around the Taj are maintained. The reflecting pool still reflects. The Yamuna is no longer clean. The Yamuna today, at Agra, is heavily polluted. The industrial and agricultural effluence of a vastly larger population than the 17th century could have imagined have transformed the river from the clear waterway beside which the marble arrived by boat into one of India's most polluted rivers. This is the price of the prosperity that the centuries have brought. The modern Indian economy, the population of over 1 billion people, the agricultural intensification that feeds them, these have come at a cost that the Yamuna bears. The Taj Mahal's white marble is yellowing slowly from the pollution in the air that the city's industries and traffic produce. There is a green haze that settles on the marble in warm weather from the algae that the polluted river water feeds. The Indian government has been working on this. The air quality around the Taj Mahal is now monitored. Certain industrial activities near the monument have been restricted. The work of preserving the Taj from the consequences of the world that has grown up around it is a permanent, ongoing task. Hamid's calligraphy on the Baburnama, if the manuscript has survived, is in an archive somewhere. The manuscripts of the Imperial Library are distributed across the world. The Kinkwab weavers of Agra are still working. The tradition survives, maintained by families who have kept the drawloom technique through the centuries, producing the cloth that is now sold in boutiques and exported to the same European markets that once bought it from trading companies. The bazaar is different, as all bazaars are different after 4 centuries, but the Yamuna ghats are still used. The morning bathing ritual is still there. The sound of the azan is still there, 5 times a day from the mosques that survived. The jasmine still blooms in season. The city continues. What the Mughal Empire achieved in the century and a half of its greatest power is difficult to fully hold in the mind. The architecture alone, the Red Fort in Delhi, the Agra Fort, the Fatehpur Sikri, the Bibi Ka Maqbara, the dozens of smaller tombs and mosques and garden pavilions that are distributed across the subcontinent, is a built record of enormous ambition, considerable technical achievement, and the aesthetic synthesis that produced a style recognizable across continents. The manuscript tradition, the illustrated histories, the poetry collections, the natural history paintings that document the flora and fauna of the subcontinent with the precision of a scientific project, is a visual record of a culture that valued the accurate observation of the world. The music, the classical tradition that developed in the Mughal courts, and that continues, in its living form, in the performances of contemporary Indian classical musicians, is a tradition of oral transmission that has carried, through 400 years of continuous practice, the knowledge of the ragas and the improvisation tradition that the court musicians developed. And the cuisine, the Mughal cooking that gave North Indian food its characteristic flavor profile, its spice vocabulary, its slow cooking techniques, is perhaps the most widely distributed legacy of the empire, present in restaurants from London to New York to Sydney in the form that, however transformed by distance and adaptation, traces its origin to the imperial kitchens of Agra. These legacies are uneven in their survival. The architecture has been partially preserved, partially lost. The manuscripts are scattered. The music is alive but changed. The cuisine is everywhere but transformed. This is the shape of all legacies. What survives is a fraction of what was. What is remembered is a fraction of what survived. And what is understood is a fraction of what is remembered, but the fraction is extraordinary. And the ordinary lives, Noor's biryani and Hamid's pen and Rajan's letter and Farrukh's notebook, those are the substrate beneath the extraordinary fraction. The jasmine in the courtyard, the azan at dawn, the water drawn before the cooking could begin. The ordinary days that made the empire possible, that made the Taj Mahal possible, that made everything possible. The ordinary days, unrecorded, continuing. Noor woke the next morning before the azan. This was unusual. Her body had woken her, which it sometimes did, the internal clock of a person who had been doing the same things at the same time for many years, anticipating the day before the day's first signal. She lay in the darkness for a moment. She could hear Amir's breathing beside her. She could hear the faint sound of the city beginning. Somewhere, a cart was moving, its wooden wheels on the stone of a distant street. The jasmine smell was coming in through the latticed window. At night, when the temperature dropped and the air was still, the jasmine smell concentrated became almost sweet enough to be overwhelming. This morning it was right. She breathed it. She thought about the day, the bread, the water, the accounts she needed to check because the monthly accounting was overdue, Amina's lesson, the neighbor's daughter's wedding next week which required preparation. She did not think of this as burden. This was her life, her household, her children, her morning before the morning. She heard the muezzin begin. She rose. She moved through the dark house as she always moved without needing light, knowing every surface. She went to the kitchen. She opened the stove's draft. She coaxed the banked coals. The first light came, red and tentative, from the coals. The household began to breathe. She put on the water. The day began. You are in your bed. The jasmine smell is in the air. The azan has passed. Hamid's pens are ready for tomorrow. Rajan's letter is on its way to Surat. The Yamuna is moving east beside the marble building that is not yet finished. And somewhere in the city, the sound of a single cart on stone in the darkness before dawn. Sleep well. And that for tonight is Agra, the greatest city in the world in its greatest century, the city of the Taj Mahal and the calligrapher's pen and the jasmine in the courtyard, and the woman who woke before the azan and put on the water and started the day. Thank you for being here tonight. A new story arrives every day. Subscribe and keep the lamp burning. Tell me where you're listening from. I want to know. Good night.